Good evening, everyone. Today I'm really proud to invite all of you to this program, Reinterpreting the Indian History, Redefining Secularism in University Spaces, organized by DAMSA, TSA and PDSU. So, as you all know, we have been having a series of discussions regarding caste, the dominant narratives, and critiquing the dominant festival. So, I would like to start with the obvious question. Being modern and secular participants of an academic space, which is supposed to be secular, why do we need to bring the questions of belief or religion into the discussion? Because it is supposed to offend the sentiments of a section of people. Now, why this happens? Now I would like to quote Talal Asad. Public sphere is made up of sensibilities, the hopes, fears, aspirations, and memories of speakers and listeners. In such a public sphere, like the secular academic spaces, when certain dominant festivals are celebrated, certain killings and deaths are celebrated in a particular way, where certain figures are mutilated over and over again, obviously certain sensibilities or feelings will be hurt. The question then comes, who has the validity to be heard? Whose sentiments are we considering here? When certain sections are being heard, it becomes a big issue, where even the state intervenes to protect them. But whereas the minorities, no one is there to question. So, which brings us to the very point where we have to redefine the secularism in academic spaces. Now, I would like to invite our speakers to the dais. We have Yogesh Master joining us. He is one of the famous cultural activists from Karnataka. He is also the author of the controversial novel Dundi. I invite him to the dais now. And we have Professor Sathyanarayana from the Department of History, Osmania, joining us to enlighten our views on this issue. And also we have our very own Dr. Taradishwar. First, I would request Professor Sathyanarayana to talk.
That's what I wanted. Good evening, everybody. Well, I want to provide a sort of an historical background for the evolution of Hindutwa as articulated by Tilak, the so-called militant nationalist, who was responsible for making Ganesh Festival a so-called national festival. And he was perhaps the foremost Brahmanical ideologue who used public space for inculcating nationalism through Hindu religious cultural symbols. It is in the last 2 decades of the 19th century that the construction of Hindu identity by the upper caste, predominantly Brahmin nationalists, had begun in a context in which there was an upsurge on the part of the subaltern castes and communities who were struggling for liberation and demanding freedom and social justice. It is in this context that invocation of Hindu symbols, religious symbols, and propagation of Hindu ritual in the form of Ganesh Festival, Shivaji Festival, by Tilak, acquired a particular significance. In terms of constructing a pan-Indian Hindu identity and projecting nationalism in clear casteist terms. In fact, long before Savarkar, it was perhaps Tilak who used terms like Indian nation, Hindu nation, Hinduism, Hinditwa, nationalism interchangeably. When we are trying to understand the trajectory of Hindutva, perhaps we could draw certain parallels. It appears to me that it's exactly around 1980s that when the Dalit versions of this country are articulating their liberation and asserting their identity and demanding justice, that the Hindutva forces launched an onslaught against the subaltern castes and communities. Similarly, in Maharashtra, when Tilak propagated the Ganesha and Shivaji festivals during 1880s and 1890s, was perhaps also a period in which, in Maharashtra in particular, Jyotiba Phule, spearheading the anti-Brahmanical struggle and anti-caste struggle, and launching ideological and organizational onslaught for the empowerment of the Dalit Bahujans. Around the same time, the upper caste nationalist liberal bourgeois intellectuals like Ranade, Lokhitwadi, Gokhale were trying to articulate a scientific, it could be called as a, scientific, rational nationalism. A nationalism which is secular, which is inclusive, as it was articulated by the upper caste reformers like Ranade, Gokhale, Lokhitwadi, and others. Tilak was opposed to both the bourgeois liberal reformists like Ranade, Gokhale, as well as he was also virulently opposing Sathyanarayana and Jyotiba Phule. I think now we could see perhaps certain historical continuities from the late 19th century till present. And so therefore, it is, in a way, it was Dr. Ambedkar, who said that Tilak did greatest harm, I quote, Tilak did greatest harm to the cause of social and political reform in India. What Dr. Ambedkar meant was that Tilak spearheaded an Hindutva ideology to preserve the caste system, the hierarchical caste system, and maintain what he called the Varna Dharma. And interestingly, the kind of the Hindu identity that Tilak constructed was based exclusively on caste identity. So, it is in the late 19th century that Tilak, along with the Bengal nationalists, some of them also revolutionary terrorists, who are also invoking religious symbols. If Ganapati and Shivaji are the symbols that Tilak invoked, it was Durga, that was invoked by the Bengali revolutionary terrorists and militant nationalists. So therefore, for us, to me, it is important to examine the historical process of the evolution of Hindutva and contextualize Tilak's articulation of the notion of Hindutva. His attempts to popularize Shivaji and Ganesh festivals in the public space to mobilize the masses against colonialism, and the invocation of Hindu cultural and religious symbols to invoke nationalist spirit resulted in the construction of Hindutva ideology. Tilak's construction of Hindu nationalism must be seen in the light of social reforms which were increasingly becoming anti-Brahmanical. The attempts made by Tilak to popularize Hindu religious and cultural symbols in the public domain was to contain the articulation of freedom and social justice by the downtrodden communities. The essential features of Tilak's Hindutva were to defend varnashrama dharma, caste system, patriarchy, and negate gender equality and empowerment of the weaker sections. In other words, Tilak's Hindutva was meant to maintain, not only maintain the hierarchical caste system and the Brahmanical domination, but also negate, very consciously. Today we have so much new research coming up, which in fact dissects the different segments of Tilak's thought, and in fact now comes up with certain new conclusions. So I'm trying to sort of put before you some of these new findings, in which Tilak's construction of Hindutva exclusively on the basis of Hindu caste system and his negation of the assertion of the oppressed and the downtrodden communities is significant. If there is one direct contrast, let us say, between the 19th century, late 19th century articulation of Tilak and the present day articulation of the Hindutva forces, we could see so many commonalities. And for Tilak, as you all know, that he is a Chitpavan Brahmin, an orthodox Brahmin family belonging to the landed aristocracy of Western Maharashtra. And in the context of colonial onslaught, some of those upper caste elements which were destabilized by colonial intervention and colonial modernity, they sought to maintain, their kind of a position in opposition to the colonial rule, and whatever they articulated, they took the name of nation. So Tilak himself claimed what he was essentially articulating was to preserve this status quo and to maintain the landed gentry's particular privileges, and also to preserve the caste system, the so-called Indian social system, which was very systematically, the so-called Varna ideology was systematically preserved by the Peshwas, who were dethroned by the British colonial rule. So therefore, since Chitpavans were part and parcel of the Peshwa rule, so for him, the colonial modernity and intervention tended to destabilize the traditional elites. So therefore, there was in fact an opposition by the disprivileged, what Gramsci calls the traditional intelligentsia, the traditional intellectuals. So Tilak represented the interests of the Chitpavan Brahmanical, communities as the interests of the nation. So he himself claims, Tilak called himself a Rashtravadi, nationalist, and claimed to defend the interests of the nation. So the nation that Tilak constructed was an exclusive nation of the upper caste Brahmanical forces. In his concept of a nation, minorities, Muslims do not figure. The non-Brahmins and the Dalits and other bodies do not figure. So it was a nation, again, as I understand it, was an exclusive notion. And particularly, Tilak's vehement opposition to Jyotiba Phule and the liberal bourgeois reformers was very, very significant, because today, what we witness today in the present civil society is that the space that is perhaps occupied by the liberals in the decades of 60s and 70s, as a kind of a legacy of Nehruvian, kind of an articulation, that liberal space is now increasingly getting, shrinking. So similarly, Tilak targeted both the liberal bourgeois ideologues as well as the Dalit Bahujan ideologues. So, in fact, he opposed the 19th century social reformers like Phule, Ranade, Gokhale, and regarded them, I quote, as destroyers of Hindu religion, culture, and society. And I don't have time to go into the way that he tried to debunk and ridicule the Prarthana Samaj, for example. One organization that was supported by the upper caste, Western educated intellectuals who were arguing programs of women's empowerment, gender equality, education for the non-Brahmins and the women. And in fact, Karve, who was responsible for the establishment of the first women's university in Pune, was opposed to Tilak. I mean, Tilak was so-called progressive militant nationalist, but he was the arch-orthodox social, philosopher or social activist. His blatant denigration of a place, a respectable place for the downtrodden communities is very revealing. Now, in 1960, when Karve proposed the establishment of the women's university, Tilak opposed it vehemently. And, he also said that women's place is not in the public sphere. Public domain is not meant for the women. So it is the women are confined to the domestic sphere. I mean, I've got long quotations, but I would only like to say that in a series of articles in his newspaper Maratha, he defined the place of women in the civil society. And he deliberately said, okay, while he welcomed some kind of a new awakening, to be imparted to the women, but he was very conscious that the women should be confined to the domestic sphere. And what kind of a curriculum that should be there? While Karve, Ranade and other, including Jyotiba Phule, were arguing for a scientific, non-religious curriculum in the colleges and universities, Tilak argued that women should be taught, the Puranas, and they should be taught the management of home. So he was very clear as to where the woman's position is. And he said, while he opposed a separate university for the women and also college education for women, he said that curriculum should consist of cooking, I quote, cooking and other useful domestic art. And when Karve and others argued compulsory education for the girls, he opposed. Said, there should be the available resources could not be wasted on making compulsory elementary education for the girls. So therefore, today's historical research clearly brings up the conservative dimension of the thought of Tilak. Because his conservatism, his negation of gender equality is very much rooted in his concept of the nation, the Hindu nation. And the Hinditwa. There are a number of instances where, because we can understand Tilak's ideology in his writings, in his two newspapers, Maratha in English and Kesari in Marathi. And today we have new research coming up which has clearly brought out how he conceptualized the nation, in terms of certain categories which are meant to maintain the status quo. Now, with regard to the use of public space for religious articulation, Shivaji, of course, as we all know, that he was an icon for Jyotiba Phule and other Dalit Bahujans in Maharashtra. They had seen or characterized Shivaji as a people's king, as a symbol of empowerment, as a symbol of pride, so to speak, to the Marathas. But Shivaji was interpreted by Tilak exclusively in terms of a defender of Hindu faith, an opponent of the Muslims. So he eulogized the killing of Afzal Khan, by Shivaji through foul means. He said he justified the method used by Shivaji by saying that, such great men, for them ethics are a different sort. So therefore, by invoking Shivaji as an opponent of the Muslims, or who was the champion of dethroning the Muslim power, and becomes the what you call champion of the Hindus. Now this reduction of Shivaji as a symbol of Hindu identity, Hindu unity, and Hindu interest, by definition negated the Muslims and other minorities. So therefore, the kind of nationalism that he articulated, the so-called militant nationalism in the early decades of the 20th century, was predominantly or exclusively Hindu nationalism. So therefore, Shivaji Festival was, in fact, it led to unfortunate communal riots. And Tilak was deliberate. You see, there was a kind of a law and a kind of a customary observation since the pre-colonial times that both the communities respected their religious sacred spaces. The Hindus did not play music when on Friday the namaz is taking place. So that was accepted. Now, of course, the colonial state, in fact, it passed a law prohibiting playing of the music in front of the mosque. But the Hindutva forces deliberately violated it, negated it, and it led to a series of communal riots in northern India, including Maharashtra. So the enactment of a revolt, communal riot in the public sphere is one of the important instruments in fostering Hindu identity. Now, secondly, I just want to sum up in a few minutes with regard to Ganesha. You see, we all know Maharashtra has a very strong bhakti tradition, popular Hinduism. And Jyotiba Phule and a number of other social reformers, including the liberal bourgeois intellectuals of Maharashtra, always invoked bhakti, saints and bhakti, as a means of, let's say, fostering unity and identity. Tilak was aware of that. For example, in Maharashtra, we know the Vitholba, Khandoba, tradition was very strong. And the pilgrimage of Khandoba was used, for mass mobilization and inculcating this popular, Hinduism, where inclusiveness, cohabitation, respecting the others was ingrained. Tilak invoked Ganesh because Ganesha happened to be the family deity of the Peshwas. And Tilak, being a Chippavan and associated with the Peshwas, deliberately used Ganesha. And in fact, at the same time, in the 1890s, Jyotiba Phule gave a call to the non-Brahmins not to participate in these Ganesha festivals and not to give donations to the Brahmins, not to employ the Brahmin priests. And an alternative spirituality, an alternative priesthood, a non-Brahmanical, celebration of rituals and domestic events was put into practice by Jyotiba Phule. So, while Jyotiba Phule was consistently opposing the misuse of the public space by invoking the Ganesha festival, Tilak consistently used it, and after the death of Jyotiba Phule, he succeeded, in winning over a number of other segments. But in any case, the Ganesha festival becomes an important instrument to foster a kind of an unity and identity among the Hindus, and Ganesha is deliberately propagated as a deity which would reach out to the people, and the whole lot of processions, whole lot of singing, etc. that went on was also anti-minorities and anti-Muslims. The kind of songs that were sung during Ganesha festival were clearly anti-Muslim, and they exhorted the people the non-Brahmins and others, not to participate in Muharram. You see, Muharram was one festival. Irrespective of the caste, community, gender, people participate. It is a kind of a popular, expression of this Hindu-Muslim unity, so to speak, and communal harmony. And during the Ganesha celebrations, it was deliberately, practiced by these Hindutva forces to inculcate this anti-Muslim spirit. And this again, to me, is significant, because what is happening today, in terms of the public enactment of rites and rituals by the Hindutva forces and the onslaught on the minorities, I think has some historical parallels. So therefore, I would like to suggest that in Tilak's Hindutwa, he clearly explained that defending caste system and opposing English education for women and non-Brahmins as Hindutva. He felt English education to women and non-Brahmins as un-national tendencies and against national interest, against the Hindu nation. He also said that reformers are no longer Hindus as they undermined the caste system. Hence, they formed a separate nationality. Tilak considered caste as the basis of Hindu nationality, and the right to control in the society from within was Swaraj for him. For him, Swaraj and self-rule doesn't mean the equal sharing of power or homogenization of power in civil society. It was the defense of the existing social, unequal social system that was, for him, is Swaraj. He constantly used the terms, the Hindu nation, to defend caste system. He also used Indian nationality, Hindu nationality, Hindutva, Varnashram Dharma as interchangeable terms. Anything that undermines the institution of caste, according to him, amounted to the loss of nationality. He repeatedly declared that the basis of Hindu nation is caste. For him, protection and elevation of the caste hierarchy constituted the basis of national identity / Hindutva. And interestingly, to define his Hindutva and to foster this kind of Hindu identity, he took Gita as his source of authority. When he was arrested in the 1890s, when he spent about 4 years or so in Mandalay jail, he read Gita and he wrote a commentary on Gita. Interestingly, it was Gita, in which Krishna, exhorted. Therefore, for Tilak, Gita becomes an important source, for constructing the so-called Hindu nation. At the same time, he also defended Manusmriti. He said that that text was considered to be one of the best Sanskrit works that has ever come across. And he felt that Manodharma Shastra and other Dharma Shastras are the defined laws of the Hindus, so much so that in 1911, when Vittalbhai Patel, the elder brother of Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, introduced a bill in the central legislature to promote intercaste marriages, the entire Hindu orthodoxy opposed it. All the Shankaracharyas and the so-called proponents of Hinduism opposed it. And Tilak wrote articles in Maratha opposing the intercaste marriage bill. So that indicates as to what kind of a nation that Tilak wanted build, and what kind of a notion of identity that he was seeking to establish, and perhaps that it has some kind of an echo in the present day scenario of the rise of the Hindutva force. Thank you very much for your patience. Very much.
Thank you so much.